Hello everyone. So today we're going to do some very quick review. We're going to look at developing your topic, talk about trustworthy sources, then discuss avoiding plagiarism and paraphrasing. So let's dig right in. If you have your handout packet available, or you can watch here on the screen, some really quick review. So remember, this is a compare and contrast paper in MLA format. And I emphasized before, and I want to emphasize again, you have to research both your country and the US on your topic. So make sure that you're not spending all your time researching your country. At some point, shift and look up some articles on the US on that topic. You'll have to read at least 10 to 12 academic articles. Could be more than that, though you can skim much of those articles, so it shouldn't be too hard. Because of the length of the paper, avoid history and historical topics. In a short paper, you're not going to be able to accomplish what I want you to accomplish by using history or historical topics. There'll be a minimum of 7 sources, and at least 5 need to be academic journals and 2 other trustworthy sources, though your easiest route is to use all 7 academic journals. Then you don't have to worry about trustworthiness. At least 75% of your paper needs to be based on academic journals. So if you are struggling with locating academic journals on your topic, make sure to reach out to me, reach out to a librarian, or slightly adjust your topic. You could slightly adjust your country or make a slight change in your topic. You could change your keywords, etc. And please remember that Wikipedia was preliminary research. It cannot be used in the final paper. Okay, so I think I want to skip to page 8. So I mentioned before that academic journals are the most trustworthy source that we have. One of the reasons for this, so let me give an example. I worked for a academic journal. I was an editor for a couple of years, and we were a small academic journal, not even a very prominent one. And we had a board of over 100 reviewers. Every single one of them had a terminal degree in their field and were experts on the field that we were writing about. University studies is what it was, studies of the university. So we had a panel of over 100 experts in the field that reviewed every single article that was going to be published in that academic journal. And all of them had to sign off on each article before it would be published. Okay, so when you have 100 experts in a field saying, yes, this deserves to be here, that creates an extremely high level of trust. And so it's important to note that, because when you ask the average person, what sources are trustworthy, often they don't see academic journals as any more or less trustworthy than, say, a newspaper or a magazine or a blog or a news website, right? When in reality, you have so many experts poring over them. They are the most trustworthy source you can get. Every once in a long time, there will be problems in academic journals, just like there will be with any sources, but it is very minuscule, a very small amount. So academic journals are what the focus of this paper should be. It is one of the things I'll be evaluating the most when I grade your papers, is can they find and use and synthesize academic resources. Okay, so as I said, academic journals are the most trustworthy. Okay. But if you are going to use other sources, you need to evaluate them for trustworthiness. It's kind of an art rather than a science. There's no one magic thing that establishes trustworthiness. It's, does it hit on multiple categories that we're going to talk about here. Okay, so some of the most trustworthy beyond academic journals are American government websites, especially well-known organizations within the government, like the CDC, the Census, or similar health or scientific agencies in the U.S. We still, although most things have been politicized, we still have a lot of governmental parts of our government, research-based parts of our government that have high levels of trustworthiness. So, well-known scientific organizations, well-known medical organizations are also highly trustworthy. If you don't know if they're well-known and widely respected organizations, some quick Google searches could help you figure that out. Or you can ask me or a librarian. Books from trustworthy sources. And what that means is somebody who is an expert in their field, has a terminal degree of some kind. We'll talk about that in a minute. Or has a very high degree with decades of experience. So a person who has a 4-year degree and hasn't worked in the field very long is going to be much lower than somebody who has a PhD and has worked in the field for 2 decades. Also, foreign government data is medium level of trust. Many European nations would be higher. Many other nations might be a little less trustworthy. You might want to check with me on that. By the way, just to go back from American government websites, one that I highly recommend that would be really useful for you would be called CIA Factbook. They produce all kinds of basic facts about the countries you're studying. So if you need some basic facts, go to CIA Factbook, Google it, and then locate the country you're studying about. It can give you a lot of basic trustworthy stats from a very trustworthy source. Okay, so for books from trustworthy sources, as I said, find out who's writing. Same thing with newspaper, website, periodicals. Find out who is this person writing. If there's no author listed, that is a huge question mark and is going to be very difficult to establish trustworthiness. So if you're finding articles that don't have an author, there are very rare circumstances where that'll be a high level of trust. So find out who's writing. Are they an expert in their field with a terminal degree? And you say, well, I don't know what the terminal degree is in psychology, or I don't know what the terminal degree is in whatever. Just Google. Just say, what is the terminal degree in psychology, right? And it should come up immediately. Okay, evaluate date written. As we've discussed before, about 10 to 12 years for our purposes. And that's what you should set your limiters at in the databases. In scientific or medical fields, it's usually 5 years. Evaluate for bias. So bias is a prejudice in favor or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. This occurs often in regards to race, age, ethnicity, experience, gender, location, class, income, occupations, politics, or religion. All people have biases, so it's important to be aware that sources may have these biases as well. Peer review or academic journals is one effective method for reducing this bias. Look for phrases like "in my opinion," "I think," "I believe," or similar that indicate that it's an opinion for bias. Also look for extreme opinions, hyperbole, and exaggeration. If no matter what the source is, if you're getting a lot of that, it lowers the trustworthiness of the source. There are some cases where you can use biased sources, but you would need to identify them as that and then justify why you're using it. And it often could be, if you have a well-respected, high trustworthy source that gives you data on something, and then you use a more opinionated piece that you identify as such to comment on that data. Okay, so identify purpose, tone, and supporting evidence. Another way to look for potential bias is to identify the author's purpose, tone, and evidence. Look for the reason that they're writing. Are they trying to inform or persuade? If they're trying to persuade, be very careful, because then you realize that author is coming in with an agenda. There's nothing wrong with trying to persuade, but you need to identify it as such and then evaluate whether it's trustworthy or not. This is why academic journals are so, um, why that should be your focus, is because anything beyond academic journals, you have to evaluate on a lot of these levels of trust. If the author is claiming that their purpose is to inform, yet most of the article is focused on persuasion, then the source might be less trustworthy. They might have a hidden motive or an agenda. Identifying purpose also helps the reader evaluate for conflict of interest. For example, an organization like PETA might post articles on their websites that are critical of the meat industry because it matches their agenda of convincing people to consume less meat. Therefore, any article from this source should be viewed skeptically and evaluated for trustworthiness. Does the author have a personal stake in the issue? Who's funding the study? So, a lot of people think, so PETA is highly politicized, and so people might say, of course they're biased. But you could, many different animal or wildlife organizations, smaller medical organizations, any organization that's trying to convince you, that's trying to, like an organization like PETA or the ASPCA even, they need your money. They need your support, right? And so what happens is even the most well-meaning people in organizations like that might use selective evidence or might use hyperbole about the problem, right? So if you're using a source from an organization, a nonprofit organization that's trying to persuade you, see if they cite where their information comes from, and then go find that site or that source, because you can't just trust whatever is on one of these organizations' websites. You need to go find out where they got their information and is it trustworthy or not. Another way to look for bias is through identifying tone. Does the author sound positive, negative, or neutral? If an article refers to a priest as a visionary, that's a positive tone. If they list them as an extremist, that's a negative tone. Then it can act as a signal post for its potential bias. In most academic writing, the author should attempt to have a neutral tone. So think of that even when you're writing your papers. The way, if you call someone an extremist versus a visionary, that can drastically change your tone. It could be that you just refer to them as a priest instead, to keep a more neutral tone. Using exclusive language about race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class, or similar can also signal bias. For example, if in an article a driver is identified as a certain gender or ethnicity, ask, is it necessary to understand the subject? If not, then it may be using exclusive language based in stereotypes that indicates bias. You might find this with your older relatives. They'll be telling you a story, and the gender or race of the individual or ethnicity might have no bearing on the story at all, yet they emphasize it, right? And then you need to think, why are they emphasizing it? Is it because they want you to play into a stereotype, or is it because they have an unconscious bias, right? Which means not purposeful, right? So exclusive language can indicate bias. Use a variety of different forms of evidence. One of the most important methods for identifying bias is to examine the evidence that an author uses or chooses not to use. If you are unsure about evidence that an author uses, then find another source and double check that evidence. If an author uses evidence from biased sources, then the article is probably untrustworthy. If an author decides not to include evidence that would be useful, then it may be untrustworthy. The most trustworthy articles reference data, expert testimony, and various other forms of evidence from trustworthy sources. So again, you can save yourself all this hassle by having all your sources be academic journals. If not, you have to say, you have to think about all these different categories listed here. And you don't need to remember them. Just have this handout with you and then evaluate your source. The most important, though, is evaluating professional affiliation. If you figure out who's writing and why they're writing, do they have a terminal degree in their field? Do they have experience? That is going to be one of the best measures for trustworthiness. If you have an author and you don't know if they have these things, Google their name and write degree or experience. If it's a common name, you might need to add the subject as well. So it could be Jeff Dory's English literature, and then try to find my background, right? Okay, so, and one important thing, we'll be talking about this soon, make sure to cite. Every sentence, oh, well, I'm sorry, this shouldn't be here. We'll talk about that soon. We'll come back to that. Okay, I want to talk about next, developing your topic. Okay, so we've talked about the paper's comparison and contrast, and you need to examine it from an American perspective and the perspective of another country, and then you'll need to draw conclusions from your findings. Okay, I'm not going to go over this, but it basically says make sure that you're both on the American side and your country side, that it's the same topic. I've had students who try to compare two different things, and that doesn't work well in a compare and contrast paper. Okay, so one thing to note is as you research and you begin to write, you should be narrowing your topic. Okay, some of you will probably have a narrow topic to start with, but most of you won't. So you may have started with education or healthcare or sports, music, etc. That you can see right here. Okay, that is a very large, wide topic. In a 5-page paper, you cannot cover that topic. Okay, you cannot do it well. What you want to ask is, can I write a book on this subject? If the answer is yes, you need to narrow it. Okay, so instead, as you're researching, as you're looking through your articles, look for ways to narrow. For example, instead of just education, art education on the secondary level in the US and Japan. Or instead of family life, look for similarities and differences in family life in the US and Thailand. And actually, that should be narrowed even more by the time you get to your final paper. Maybe a specific part of family life, right? Maybe it could be eating, rituals around eating, or it could be brother and sister relationships in US and Thailand. So narrow as you research, narrow as you write. For example, environmental conservation in Malaysia and the US, that could even be narrowed even more, right? So it could be environmental conservation with water in both areas, or with air pollution in both areas, right? Or it could be even more specific than that. But find out where your articles, what your articles say. Is there a lot on air pollution? That might lead you to focus in that direction. Is there a lot on something? Whatever there's a lot on, go the easiest route. Try to make this easier for you. And finally, the most important thing that I need to note here is make sure the topics you compare are reasonable. Okay? We're trying to compare things that are similar. And so if they're not similar, you cannot do a good compare and contrast paper. For instance, who has the stronger military, the US or Thailand? That is not a reasonable topic, because the US military is uh, the largest in the world, has the most advanced equipment, and spends more than half the world combined, right? So when you compare those two things, it's too big of a gap, right? Now, don't despair. Some of you will be like, "Oh no, there's a huge gap. My topics are unreasonable, but I've spent all this energy researching this." There's simple fix. Simple fix. Instead of saying which military is stronger, instead adjust it to something more reasonable, like what could the U.S. military learn from Thailand, and what could the Thai military learn from the U.S. So you can see just that slight thing. So it could be the U.S. military, uses too big of a footprint, builds bases in places that create animosity, right? Where Thailand works with local officials and tries to figure out solutions. I'm not saying either one of those things is true. I'm just saying tactics would be a great thing to compare, right? Because it'd be more reasonable than size of military or might of military. So don't despair if right now you're like, oh no, my topics are unreasonable. Slight adjustments can make it reasonable. You may want to reach out to me if that's needed. Okay, so I want to switch now to talking about plagiarism. This is that scary topic. It's the most important here. It's oh, ignore the sounds here. Sorry about that. Let me get out of this. Wrong slide. Okay, let me try this again. Technical difficulties. Okay, so I told you the consequences of plagiarism and clearing. You can read the page on this on the website on my syllabus. It can be failing a paper or getting a 0 on a paper. It can be failing an entire semester, or if there's a pattern, often it can mean failing out of school. So now, the thing that I want to emphasize here is most people view plagiarism as, oh, this person had malintent. This person meant to plagiarize, and so that was really bad, and so of course they should be punished. And that has not been my experience with plagiarism. Okay, whether this is true or not, or people are stretching the truth, almost every time I've confronted somebody about plagiarism, they've said, "Oh, I messed up. I did this on accident. I didn't mean to do that." Right? Now, people are just going to say that often, whether it's true or not. But here's the way that plagiarism should be viewed. Plagiarism is like having a car accident. Okay, it may be your fault. It may be the other person's fault. It may have been negligence. It may have been you weren't paying attention. But regardless, your car is wrecked. Okay? So with plagiarism, it's the same thing. Whether it's on purpose or an accident, your car's now wrecked. Right? So what we do is we spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to show you over the next couple of weeks how to build your paper and avoid plagiarism. As long as you're watching the videos, following along, asking questions, reaching out to me, you will have no problem avoiding it. But if you skip past videos, if you try to just write the way you always have, then you might have problems. Okay, so what is plagiarism? It's the unacknowledged borrowing of ideas, facts, phrases, wordings, or whole words in a paper from books, online, or any other source, as well as the copying of another student's work or using the same work in multiple classes without notifying the professor. All of these constitute plagiarism and are unacceptable in the university community. Also, things like buying a paper, that sort of thing. But the one that stands out there that people don't often realize is using the same work in multiple classes without notifying the professor. People say, it's my work, how could it be plagiarism? Well, it's considered a level of dishonesty. It's you wrote this paper for another professor and now you're trying to pass it off as the first time you wrote it, right? And that's considered plagiarism. So if you're like, oh, we're writing about other countries and I just wrote this paper in Japan in my world cultures class, I don't know. And I think I could use it, right? What you need to do is you need to come to me or come to the professor and say, listen, this paper fits really well with this topic. Could I use parts of it? What can I do here, right? And most professors will have a policy on that. They might say, nope, you got to start from scratch. Many professors like me will say, that's great. What you got to do though is use you can use parts of that, but then you got to add 5 pages of original work to that. And so if your original paper was 4 pages, well, you got to turn in a 9-page paper now. I know that's not great, but you can't use the same work in multiple classes. So as I said, students turn in plagiarized work, may receive a failing grade for the essay or the course. All plagiarism gets reported to the university. And I'm sorry, I forgot to edit this slide. Clarion uses turnitin.com, and so we'll be using that on your paper assignments as well. If you have any questions about plagiarism, let me know. But as I said, over the next week or two, we're going to extensively go over how to avoid plagiarism in your work. Okay, so let's look at, we're going to start looking at paraphrases, because often paraphrasing and quoting is where plagiarism happens. And again, even if it's on accident, your paper's wrecked. So make sure you're following along here, because learning this skill can save you from accidentally plagiarizing. Okay, so I apologize, this topic's a little dry. I usually try to have more interesting topics, but I haven't had the time to update this one. So I'm going to read the original paragraph, and then you're going to look down here and figure out, why is this unacceptable? Okay. So this is a student trying to use this paragraph in their paper. Okay, so the sample paragraph. The rise of industry, the growth of cities, and the expansion of population were the 3 great developments of the late 19th century American history. As new, larger, steam-powered factories became a feature of the American landscape in the East, they transformed farmhands into industrial laborers and provided jobs for a rising tide of immigrants. With industry came urbanization, the growth of large cities like Fall River, Massachusetts, which became centers of production as well as of commerce and trade. So here's an unacceptable paraphrase that is considered plagiarism. I'm not going to read it, but let's just say it's mostly the same paragraph with these red words. Somebody used a thesaurus to change some of the words. So the red words are the only thing that changed. Why do you think that might be plagiarism? Let's look at it. So the main reason is the writer has only changed around a few words or phrases, or changed the order of the original sentences. So not enough, the author hasn't put enough of themselves into the work. The writer has also failed to cite a source for any of the ideas of facts, though it would still be plagiarism even with a citation. So even if you added citations, which we're going to talk about more in this coming week, even if you add citations to that paragraph, it's still plagiarism because it's too much of the author's original work. Let's look at another version. Okay, so here's the sample paragraph. Here's an acceptable paraphrase. Think about why this is acceptable. Fall River was typical of northeastern industrial cities of the 19th century. Steam-powered production had shifted labor from agriculture to manufacturing, and as immigrants arrived in the U.S., they found work in these new factories. As a result, populations grew and large urban areas arose. Fall River was one of these manufacturing and commercial centers. Okay? So think, what's different about this than the last paragraph? Okay. First, we see citations. This is what citations are going to look like in MLA. Last name, page number. And once you've used a source in the same paragraph, if you use it again, then without anything in between, then you can just use the number. Okay. A quick note here before I explain the rest. What you want to do is every line of text, every sentence that's paraphrased, quoted, or summarized even, needs to have a citation on it. So if you have 4 sentences in a row that came from your text, that you paraphrase from your text, each one needs a citation. Students want to use about 4 to 5 sentences of paraphrases and quotes, and then put the citation at the end of the paragraph. That doesn't work, because that means for 4 or 5 sentences, I'm like, where the heck is this coming from? And then seeing the citation at the end. So every sentence that's paraphrased, summarized, or quoted from a text needs to have a citation. And if you say, oh, well, this just looks funny with 4 or 5 sentences in a row with citations, there's a reason for that. We're going to discuss that much more coming up, but the primary reason is that's too much of the author's material in one paragraph. You should be doing other things, which we'll talk about. Okay, so the reason this is acceptable is because it uses citation, so it clearly indicates where the material came from. It does it on each line that comes from that original material. The paragraph itself is in the author's own words, and it accurately relays that information. Okay, let's look at one more. So we have, I'm not going to read it, but it's the author's own words, okay, their own language. But then, and you see the citations, and we have that on each line that came from the text. But one difference here is the author wanted to use some of the unique phrasing from this text. So in the previous example, the author summarized and paraphrased in their own words. They didn't use any unique phrasing from that paragraph above. Okay, in this case, they said, there's no way I can put this part into my own words. So I want to use their direct phrase. So in that case, you use quotation marks. Okay, so that's unique phrases from this paragraph that can't be paraphrased or put into your own words. Even with the quote, you need the citation. Okay, so it records the information in the original passage accurately. It gives credit for the ideas in the passage through citations on each sentence. And it indicated which part is taken directly from her sources by putting it in quotation marks with a page number, with citing the page number for each sentence. Okay, so we want to see citations, we want to see your own language, and when you absolutely need the language of the source, put it in quotation marks. Okay, now one thing to note there is for your papers, we're not using, because it's a short paper, I'll explain this again, but we're not using block quotes. Okay, let me show you that real quick if I can here. Okay, handout packet on the actual paper page, so page 2. Because of the length of the paper, avoid long or block quotations. Quotations should be no more than 2 to 3 lines of text. If the quotation is longer than that, consider paraphrasing, or as a last resort, extend the length of the paper to make up for the lengthy quotation. Okay, so here's some suggestions for how to avoid plagiarizing. Put quotations around everything that comes directly from the text. I had you do this on your notes page, and so you need to do that in your paper. Paraphrase, but be sure you're not just rearranging or replacing a few words. Okay, so the technique I recommend is reading the article or reading the section you want to paraphrase, reading it maybe one or two times, um, and then minimizing it so it's out of your sight. Write it in your own words, and then this is the part that students often skip. After you write in your own words, pull up the original and make sure you're not using any unique phrasing from the source. Okay, the reason for that is sometimes our minds, even when we think we're writing in our own words, borrows. so, so check it against the original source and make sure that you're not using unique phrasing. Okay. Okay, so a lot of students, when you're studying about, say you're studying about hijabs in Turkey or scarves in Turkey, headscarves, and you're like, I don't know anything about that, and so of course everything's going to be from sources, quotes, paraphrases, etc. But then they go to look in the U.S. Actually, I think a better example is marriage. Okay, so they're studying marriage in India and the U.S., and they write all about Indian weddings, use all their sources. But then they go to write about the American side, and they say, you know what, I grew up in this culture, I know everything there is to know about marriages, so I'm just going to write from my own memory. Or maybe they've only got a few hours before the deadline, and so they have to. And so they say, brides wear white for this reason, and they wear a veil for this reason, and the best man does this because of this, right? I've had students do that a number of times over the years. And the reason that doesn't work is because their information is often horribly wrong. Just as an example here, most of American traditions come from the days when women were property in the U.S., right? Actually, we had laws of women being property in the U.S. right up into the 1950s and 60s. But if you go to the earliest 20th century and beyond, women were property. And so nearly every part of our marriage system reflects that in some way. It's the ring indicates ownership. The veil is the woman as a package to be unwrapped. And it needs to be a white package to indicate that this package has not been ruined or violated in any way. The father gives away the daughter to the husband so that the male who owns this property is giving it to another. Even who pays for the wedding and who pays for the rehearsal and all that is based on the dowry system. Okay, so the woman takes the man's last name as another indication of property being transferred, and so on. And so it's students will write all these things about marriage in the U.S. and every single one of them is wrong. And so the reason for this is they're using what's called common knowledge, but they're missing one part of common knowledge. Okay, so what is it first? Common knowledge are facts that can be found in numerous places and are likely to be known by a lot of people. Example, John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States in 1960. This is generally known information. Even if you do not know it, it's reasonable to assume that a large percentage of the population does. However, and this is the part that the marriage people miss, you must document facts, I'm sorry, no, that's not true. I'll come back to that. However, you must document facts that are not generally known and ideas that interpret facts. So for our purpose, it will be considered common knowledge if approximately 25 of your classmates would know it. But this is the part that people miss with common knowledge. And it is correct information. Okay? So can you use common knowledge in your paper? A little bit, right? But at least 25% of your classmates need to know it. It needs to be correct information, so you need to verify that. And here's the part, it's not written here, but it can't common knowledge can't replace evidence from sources. You could use it in addition, but you should never have a paragraph in your paper that's only based on common knowledge. Some evidence from a source needs to be in every paragraph. Okay? If you use common knowledge, you could add it to a source. But again, remember, you need to verify it's correct information. Think of that marriage question. Okay, so if you have any questions, make an appointment with me. I need to update my email here. Make an appointment with me via Zoom, or ask a course question in that discussion thread, or email me. We're going to look at this one more time in class, just to make sure you're getting the paraphrase information. But I think that's where we're going to tie it up today. So please contact me with any questions, and thank you.